The North Atlantic in late February 1943 did not merely chill the skin, it gnawed at the bones. At 03:17 hours on the 22nd, under a sky scoured clean of stars by a low, racing overcast, the merchant steamer SS Empire Mallow wallowed through a trough of black water 380 miles west of Reykjavik. The wind howled across her deck like a banshee with a grudge, flinging spume that froze on the railings in jagged lace. Below decks, in the galley's cramped, steam-fogged belly, Petty Officer Third Class Arthur Archie. Finch wiped sweat from his brow with a flour-dusted forearm and listened. Not to the groan of the ship's aging triple expansion engine, nor to the clatter of pots from the scullery, but to the silence between them. The absence of something he couldn't name, but knew with a cook's instinct for imbalance should have been there. Archie wasn't a sailor by trade. Before the war, he'd run a modest chop house in Hull, where the only submarines he'd ever seen were the ones drawn by schoolboys in the margins of newspapers. At 41, he'd been deemed too old for frontline service, but the Royal Navy had taken him anyway. "We'll feed you if you feed us," the recruiting officer had said with a wink, and so he de-traded his apron for a navy blue jumper and found himself aboard a slow convoy vessel peeling potatoes in a steel box that rocked like a cradle in a hurricane. He knew meat temperatures, not Morse code, could judge the doneness of a joint by the smell of its fat rendering, not the pitch of a propeller. And yet, as the Empire Mallow limped eastward with Convoy on 166, Archie had begun to notice a pattern no one else seemed to register. It started 3 nights earlier, during the U-boat Wolfpack's first strike. The sky had erupted in magnesium flares, painting the sea in ghastly silver, and torpedoes had ripped through 2 tankers ahead of them. Archie had been hauling bread trays to the mess when the first explosion hit, close enough that the deck bucked beneath his boots like a startled horse. In the chaos, as men scrambled to battle stations and the ship's single 4-inch gun barked into the dark, Archie had crouched near the galley's aft bulkhead, pressing his ear to the cold steel. He heard the usual din, the thrum of the engine, the hiss of steam pipes, the distant crackle of radio chatter. But then, beneath it all, a new sound, faint, rhythmic, almost organic, like the whisper of 1,000 fingernails dragging across wet glass. It lasted only seconds before vanishing, but it returned the next night, and the next, always just before a U-boat attack. He mentioned it to the ship's chief engineer, a burly Scot named McAllister, during a rare quiet moment over lukewarm tea. "Sounds like cavitation," McAllister grunted, stirring sugar into his cup with a rusted spoon. "Propellers churning air when they spin too fast, common in rough seas, nothing to fret over." "But it's not rough now," Archie had replied, glancing out the porthole at the calm, oily swell. "And it only happens on certain ships, not ours, never ours." McAllister snorted. "You're hearing ghosts, Cook, or maybe it's the rum talking." There was no rum. Archie hadn't touched a drop since enlisting, but he kept listening. He began timing the intervals between the sounds, correlating them with convoy positions, noting which vessels seemed to emit them and which remained acoustically invisible. The Empire Mallow never made the noise, nor did the old tramp steamer Clan MacLeod, which limped along at barely 8 knots. But the newer Liberty ships, the ones built in American yards with those massive boxy hulls and triple-screw propulsion, always sang that eerie, glassy song before a torpedo found them. By the time ON 166 reached the western approaches, 7 ships had been sunk. Survivors clung to life rafts, their faces hollowed by shock and salt. Archie watched them being hauled aboard the escort destroyer HMS Vidette, their lips blue, their eyes vacant. One young deckhand, no older than 19, kept muttering, "They knew. They always knew where we were." Archie didn't correct him. He already suspected the truth. The U-boats weren't just spotting convoys with radar or visual sightings. They were hearing them from miles away through the deep, cold water that carried sound better than air. The Royal Navy called it passive sonar. German U-boat crews called it Schallortung, sound location. Hydrophones mounted on the bow of every U-boat could pick up the acoustic signature of a convoy long before it appeared on the horizon. And while Allied scientists had spent years trying to muffle engine noise or develop decoys, no one had considered the propeller itself. The very thing that moved the ship might also be its loudest betrayal. Archie didn't know the term cavitation, but he understood cause and effect. In his kitchen, if a pot boiled too violently, it rattled the lid and alerted the whole mess deck. If you turned the flame down just enough, the water simmered silently. Maybe ships were the same. Maybe it wasn't tea about speed or armor or zigzagging. It was about how quietly you moved through the water. He wrote a note, not a formal report, those required rank and he had none, but a folded scrap of greaseproof paper tucked into the pocket of the ship's radio operator, a lanky boy named Peters, who sometimes traded extra biscuits for Archie's leftover stew. "Tell them to check the props," it read. "The fast ones scream underwater, the slow ones don't." Peters laughed when he read it. "You want me to hand this to the captain?" "Dear sir, the cook says your boat's too loud." Archie didn't smile. "Just give it to him." 2 days later, the note was returned, unopened, with a single word scrawled across the front in red pencil. Nonsense. The convoy reached Liverpool on March 3rd, battered but intact. Archie stood on the dock as the Empire Mallow was tied up, watching dock workers unload crates of American spam and Canadian wheat. Around him, officers conferred in low voices, their faces grim. The Battle of the Atlantic was at its nadir. In the first 3 months of 1943 alone, U-boats had sunk 108 Allied ships, over 500,000 tons of vital cargo. Churchill would later write that the U-boat threat was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war. And yet, in the Admiralty's war rooms, the focus remained on radar, code breaking, and depth charges. No one was listening to the ocean's whispers. Archie requested shore leave, not for drink or women, he had neither taste nor time for either, but to visit the Liverpool Maritime Museum, where he'd heard they kept engineering schematics of merchant vessels. The librarian, an elderly woman with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers, eyed him skeptically when he asked for blueprints of Liberty ships. "You're a cook," she said flatly. "I'm also curious," he replied. She relented, producing a rolled set of plans from 1941. Archie spread them on a reading table, tracing the lines of the hull, the placement of the triple screws, the angles of the blades. He compared them to older British designs, single-screw vessels with broader, slower-turning propellers. The difference was stark. The Liberty ship's props were narrow, high revolution, designed for speed over silence. In calm water they might be efficient, but in the turbulent North Atlantic they churned the sea into froth, creating pockets of vapor, cavities, that collapsed with a sharp, resonant crack. That was the sound he'd heard. That was the beacon calling U-boats like moths to a flame. He spent 3 days in the museum, sketching modifications in the margins of his notebook. Wider blades, reduced pitch, slower RPMs. He calculated that even a 15% reduction in propeller speed might eliminate cavitation without sacrificing too much speed, dropping from 11 knots to 9.5 perhaps. Enough to stay with the convoy, enough to vanish. Back aboard the Empire Mallow, now undergoing repairs, he approached the chief engineer again, this time with diagrams. McAllister barely glanced at them. "You're asking to cripple the ship," he said. "We'd fall behind, become a sitting duck." "But if the U-boats can't hear us, they won't know we're there," Archie insisted. "And if we're alone in the fog, they'll spot us with binoculars, or radar, or luck. You think Dönitz runs his wolf packs on ears alone?" Archie had no answer. But that night, as he diced onions for stew, he made a decision. If the Navy wouldn't test his idea, he would. Not on a warship, those were off limits, but on the one vessel he could influence, the Empire Mallow herself. The captain had already approved a trial run to test new bilge pumps. Archie would piggyback on that. He'd convince McAllister to let him adjust the throttle settings during the sea trial. Just a minor calibration, he'd say. Nothing official, nothing traceable. On March 17th, under a slate-grey sky and a stiff northerly wind, the Empire Mallow slipped out of Liverpool Bay for a 24-hour shakedown cruise. Archie stood on the bridge wing, not because he belonged there, but because no one had told him to leave. Below, in the engine room, McAllister grumbled into the voice tube. Finch says to drop RPMs to 85, says it'll smooth the ride. Bloody lunatic. The captain, a weary man named Havisham, sighed. Fine, humour him. But if we're late back, he's scrubbing the heads with a toothbrush. At 1400 hours, the ship's speed dropped from 10.8 knots to 9.3. The engine note softened. The vibration in the deck plates lessened. And then silence. Not true silence, but the absence of that glassy, chittering resonance Archie had come to dread. He closed his eyes and listened. Nothing, just the sigh of wind and the slap of waves. 2 hours later, a Royal Navy submarine, HMS Celian, surfaced 5 miles off their starboard bow as part of a scheduled sonar exercise. Its hydrophone operator later filed a report. Target vessel SS Empire Mallow, undetectable beyond 3.2 nautical miles. Signature comparable to ambient sea noise. Recommend further inquiry. The report was stamped low priority and filed under anomalous acoustic readings, likely equipment error. Archie never saw it, but he felt it, in the calm of the sea, in the quiet of the engine, in the strange, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, a cook with flour in his hair and grease on his hands had heard something the admirals had missed. And in the cold, dark waters of the Atlantic, where U-boat commanders were already plotting their next strike on convoy HX-231, that silence would soon become the most powerful weapon the Allies didn't know they had. The Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division occupied a warren of smoke-stained offices in a converted townhouse on Whitehall, its walls lined with maps pinned with red and blue flags that shifted daily like tides of blood and hope. In early April 1943, Commander Lionel Price, a man whose uniform bore more starch than flesh, sat at his desk reviewing the latest convoy loss reports. His eyes, sharp as flint but weary from too many sleepless nights, skimmed over tonnage figures and coordinates until they snagged on an anomaly, convoy on 172, which had lost only 1 ship out of 38, a record low for the season. Price frowned. He flipped to the escort logs. Nothing unusual there. Standard zigzag patterns, ASDIC sweeps every hour, Huff-Duff bearings checked regularly. And yet, the U-boats had largely missed them. He called in Lieutenant Commander Eleanor Voss, the division's newest acoustic analyst, a rare woman in a sea of male egos. Her hair pinned tightly, her gaze unflinching. "Voss, look at this," he said, sliding the report across the desk. On 172. Why didn't the Wolfpack find them? She scanned the document, then tapped a line near the bottom. Notice the composition. Heavy on older single-screw vessels. Light on liberties, Price grunted. So the acoustic profile would be quieter. Less cavitation. He waved a hand. Cavitation's been studied. It's negligible beyond 5 miles. Is it? Voss pulled a file from her satchel, HMS Celian's sonar exercise report from March 17th. She placed it beside On 172's log. Same ship, Empire Mallow. Same speed reduction. Same drop in detectability. Price read it slowly, his skepticism hardening into irritation. This is based on 1 trial, 1 ship. And the suggestion came from a cook. He's the one who proposed the RPM adjustment, Voss said evenly. The engineers dismissed it, but the sub's hydrophone team confirmed it. A fluke, Price snapped, or faulty equipment. We're not slowing down convoys on the word of a man who fries sausages for a living, Voss didn't argue. She'd learned long ago that in the Royal Navy, rank spoke louder than data. But she made a note in her private ledger. Finch, A. SS Empire Mallow, acoustic dampening via propeller modulation. and she began quietly cross-referencing convoy loss rates against ship propulsion types. Meanwhile, Archie Finch had no idea his name had been whispered in Whitehall. He was back at sea, assigned to convoy HX-231, bound for New York with a cargo of coal, steel, and 12,000 tons of desperation. The Empire Mallow was one of 42 ships, escorted by 8 warships, including the new Captain-class frigate HMS Bentley, equipped with the latest Type 147B sonar. Morale was low. The men spoke in hushed tones about Black May, the nickname already circulating for what they feared would be the worst month yet. Archie kept to his galley, but his mind was elsewhere. He'd smuggled a small notebook into his kit, filled with observations, wind speed, sea state, engine RPM, and most importantly, the presence or absence of that telltale underwater whisper. He'd also taken to lingering near the engine room during watch changes, listening to the crew's chatter. One night he overheard McAllister complaining to the second engineer, "Captain's orders, maintain 10.5 knots. No deviations. Even for acoustic comfort," he says. The sarcasm was thick enough to spread on toast. Archie said nothing. But that night, during his off-watch, he crept down to the auxiliary control panel near the stern, a relic from the ship's pre-war days, rarely used, covered in dust. He studied the dials, traced the wiring. It wouldn't override the main throttle, but it could feed false readings to the bridge if manipulated just so. It was a risk. Tampering with ship controls was a court-martial offense. But if he could prove his theory in combat, on April 25th, at 02 Wamptorn hours, the convoy entered the U-boat killing zone, 500 miles southeast of Cape Farewell, Greenland. The sea was calm, the moon a sliver behind fast-moving clouds. Perfect conditions for hydrophone detection. Archie was peeling potatoes when the general alarm blared. U-boat contact, starboard bow. All hands to stations. He dropped his knife and ran to the bridge wing, heart hammering. Through binoculars, he saw the escort destroyers peeling off, depth charges rolling off their sterns. Then a flash. A torpedo struck the Liberty ship Fort Concord amidships. The explosion lit the sky like a second sunrise, casting long, dancing shadows across the water. Men screamed. Oil spread in a black slick, but Archie wasn't watching the fire. He was listening, and through the chaos, beneath the roar of engines and the crackle of burning timber, he heard it again, that glassy, chittering resonance, rising from the Fort Concord's dying screws as they spun wildly in the flooded engine room. It lasted only seconds before the ship slipped beneath the waves, but it was enough. Later in the mess, shaken survivors from the Fort Concord described how the U-boat had surfaced just 800 yards off their bow, as if it had known exactly where to aim. "Like it was waiting for us," one sailor whispered. Archie returned to the galley and made a decision. That night, during the Aero 400 watch, when the bridge crew was exhausted and the officer of the deck was dozing in his chair, Archie slipped into the auxiliary control room. With trembling hands, he adjusted the rheostat, feeding a signal that mimicked a 9.2 knot reading, while the actual RPMs dropped to 85%. The ship slowed imperceptibly, less than half a knot, but the engine note softened, the vibration ceased, and the underwater whisper vanished. He held his breath for an hour. Nothing happened. No alarms, no U-boats, just the quiet roll of the sea. At dawn, the convoy reformed. The escorts reported no further contacts. HX-231 would lose only 2 ships that day, both fast Liberty vessels that had maintained full speed. The Empire Mallow, sailing slightly slower, slightly quieter, made it through untouched. Word began to spread. Not officially, but in the way truth travels among men who face death together. On the mess deck, sailors started calling Archie Silent Finch. Some mocked him. Others watched him with new respect. One young stoker, barely 18, approached him with a question. If we all slowed down, would they stop hearing us? Archie looked at the boy's earnest face and nodded. Maybe, if we all do it together. But getting the Navy to agree was another matter entirely. Back in Liverpool, Eleanor Voss had compiled enough data to present a formal briefing. She requested a meeting with Price and the Director of Naval Construction. She brought charts, sonar logs, convoy loss comparisons. She even included Archie's original note, now preserved in a manila folder labeled Unverified Civilian Input. Price listened in stony silence. When she finished, he leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You're asking us to reduce convoy speeds across the board, to sacrifice delivery schedules, troop movements, lend-lease commitments, all based on a hypothesis derived from a cook's intuition and a handful of anomalous readings." "It's not intuition," Voss said. "It's physics. Cavitation creates broadband noise detectable at extreme range. Reduce RPMs below the cavitation threshold and you disappear. And if the U-boats switch to radar," Price countered, "or visual spotting, we become slower targets. Then we pair it with existing tactics, smoke, zigzagging, air cover. But right now, we're broadcasting our position through the ocean itself. We're shouting in a library." The Director of Naval Construction cleared his throat. "Technically, she's not wrong. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships has been studying propeller noise for months. They've even tested decavitation blades on a few destroyers." Price's eyes narrowed. And they're classified. But early results show a 70% reduction in passive sonar detection range. A long silence filled the room. Outside, a siren wailed, another air raid. Price stood, walked to the window and watched the searchlights rake the sky. When he turned back, his expression had changed. Not convinced, but cornered by the weight of mounting losses. "Run a controlled trial," he said finally. 3 convoys, all ships instructed to maintain 9.5 knots. Monitor U-boat contacts. If loss rates drop by even 20%, we'll consider wider implementation." Voss nodded, relief flooding her chest. But she knew the real test wouldn't be in spreadsheets or sonar logs. It would be in the cold black water, where U-boat captains listened for the heartbeat of the Allies, and where one cook's quiet rebellion might finally be heard. The trial convoys, HX-235, ON-178, and SC-128, sailed in staggered formation throughout May 1943, each carrying a secret cargo not listed on manifests. Silence. Under strict orders from the Admiralty, every merchant vessel, regardless of class or origin, was to maintain a steady 5 knots, with propeller revolutions held below 90 RPM. Engineers grumbled, captains protested. American skippers, used to pushing their liberties to 11 knots, called it sailing like grandmothers. But the directive came from the highest levels, stamped with the urgency of desperation. Aboard the Empty Mallow, now assigned to HX-235, Archie Finch watched the new orders with quiet satisfaction. He wasn't credited. His name appeared nowhere in the official communiqué, but he recognized his idea in the precise RPM limits, the emphasis on acoustic discipline. For the first time, he allowed himself a sliver of hope. The convoy departed Liverpool on May 3rd, under a sky heavy with unshed rain. 52 ships stretched across the horizon like a floating city, their wakes knitting together in the grey dawn light. Escort vessels, destroyers, corvettes, frigates patrolled the flanks, their sonar pinging into the deep, but this time the real defense wasn't in the depth charges or the radar scopes. It was in the restrained turn of every propeller, the collective decision to move not faster, but quieter. Archie stood on the bridge wing during the first night watch, the wind sharp with salt and diesel. He closed his eyes and listened. No glassy chitter, no resonant thrum. Just the soft sigh of water parting around hulls, the distant groan of metal settling. It was the sound of invisibility. 200 miles west of Ireland, the first test came. At 22:17 hours on May 6th, HMS Bentley's hydrophone operator reported a faint contact. Bearing 215, range estimated at 8,000 yards. "Sounds like a Type CVC," he said, voice tight. But the signature's weak, almost muffled. The escort commander, Captain Roderick Hale, hesitated. Standard procedure dictated an immediate depth charge run. But the new orders included a caveat. Do not engage unless visual confirmation is obtained. Avoid unnecessary noise. Hale, a veteran of the Arctic convoys, trusted his instincts more than memos, but he also remembered the butcher's bill of April. He signaled the convoy to hold course and speed, while Bentley and 2 corvettes crept toward the contact, engines throttled to near idle. For 40 minutes the hunt unfolded in near silence. No sonar pings, those would alert the U-boat. No radio chatter, just the slow, patient creep of steel through water. Then, at 2258 hours, a lookout on Bentley spotted a dark shape barely, breaking the surface. U-438, running on the surface to recharge batteries, its silhouette stark against the phosphorescent wake. "Engage!" Hale barked. Depth charges rolled. The sea erupted. U-438 dove, but too late. A second pattern straddled her dive path. Minutes later, oil and debris rose to the surface. U-438 was gone, but what struck Hale wasn't the kill. It was the U-boat's position. It had been ahead of the convoy, not trailing it, as if it had been waiting, listening, and heard nothing until it was too late. Back in Liverpool, Eleanor Voss received the after-action report. She cross-referenced it with hydrophone logs from 3 other escorts. All noted the same anomaly. U-boat contacts were closer, more confused, often surfacing in apparent disorientation. One U-boat, U-630, had actually collided with a merchant vessel in the fog, something almost unheard of, because it hadn't heard the ship approaching. By May 12th, HX-235 reached Halifax with only 1 ship lost, a straggler that had broken formation to assist a mechanical failure and immediately been torpedoed. ON-178 and SC-128 reported similar results. In total, the 3 trial convoys lost just 4 ships out of 147, a loss rate of 2.7% compared to the 12% average of the previous 6 months. Price summoned Voss to his office. He didn't congratulate her, but he handed her a new directive, stamped top secret, eyes only, all North Atlantic convoys to implement Operation Silent Keel, effective immediately. Speed limit, 9.5 knots. RPM ceiling, 90. Propeller cavitation to be minimized at all costs. It was the first time the Royal Navy had adopted a tactical doctrine based on acoustic stealth, and it worked. German U-boat logs from May tell a story of growing confusion. Captain Lieutenant Hans Friedrich von Bülow of U-569 wrote in his war diary, "Convoys behave strangely. No sound at expected ranges. We circle for hours, hydrophones straining, hearing only wails and distant storms. When we finally spot them visually, they are already past us." And another commander, Peter Erich Kremer of U-333, radioed U-boat command, "Allied ships have become ghosts. Either their engines are broken, or they have discovered how to sail without sound." Dönitz, furious, ordered intensified patrols. New listening protocols, even experimental hydrophones with enhanced sensitivity. But the ocean had changed. The Allies hadn't just hidden, they'd learned to move like shadows. Archie Finch, meanwhile, remained unaware of the strategic earthquake his idea had triggered. He was too busy feeding 200 hungry men 3 meals a day, his hands raw from lye soap and potato peels. But he noticed the difference. Fewer alarms, fewer funerals at sea, fewer hollow-eyed survivors hauled from lifeboats. The galley, once a place of grim routine, began to hum with something resembling hope. Then came the letter. It arrived in late May, hand-delivered by a naval courier who saluted Archie so sharply it nearly knocked his cap off. Inside, on Admiralty letterhead, was a brief note from Commander Price. "Your observations have contributed materially to a critical anti-submarine initiative. Discretion is requested. Further communication will follow. No medal, no promotion. Just acknowledgement and a warning to stay quiet." Archie folded the letter and tucked it into his sea bag beneath a spare pair of socks. He didn't need recognition. He'd seen the results in the faces of the men he fed, in the quiet nights when the only sound was the sea. But the war wasn't over, and silence, he knew, was only half the battle. By June 1943, the tide of the Battle of the Atlantic had turned, not with a bang, but with a whisper. U-boat losses soared to catastrophic levels. 41 submarines sunk in May alone, a rate the Kriegsmarine could not sustain. Dönitz, facing mutiny, among his exhausted crews, withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic on May 24th, calling it Black May in despair. Allied convoys, once hunted like prey, now crossed the ocean with near impunity. Cargo tonnage delivered to Britain surged by 40% in the second quarter of the year. Tanks, planes, fuel, food, all flowed unimpeded, laying the groundwork for the invasions to come. At the heart of this reversal lay a simple truth. The Allies had stopped shouting their location to the enemy. Operation Silent Keel, though never publicly named, became standard doctrine. Shipyards in Belfast, Halifax, and San Francisco began, retrofitting propellers with wider blades and reduced pitch. New vessels were designed from the keel up for acoustic stealth. Even the U.S. Navy, initially skeptical, adopted the RPM limits after its own tests confirmed a 97% reduction in passive sonar detection range. But Archie Finch saw none of this from the bridge of policy. He saw it in the bread he baked, more flour, less sawdust filler, in the meat that appeared on Sundays, no longer just spam, in the way the young stoker who'd once asked him about silence now joked about ghosting Jerry. Then came Convoy HX-242. Sailing from New York in late June, it carried a cargo of incalculable value, 18,000 tons of high-octane aviation fuel, 200 Sherman tanks, and the first shipment of proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, destined for the Mediterranean theater. If lost, the invasion of Sicily could be delayed by months. The stakes were higher than ever, and the Germans knew it. Intercepted Enigma decrypts revealed that Dönitz, though withdrawn, had authorized a final, desperate strike, a ghost pack of 6 U-boats equipped with the new Schnorkel breathing tubes, allowing them to run diesel engines underwater and avoid radar. They would stalk HX-242, not from the surface, but from the depths, listening. Archie felt the tension the moment the convoy formed up off Halifax. The usual banter on deck was gone. Men checked life jackets twice. The captain held extra drills. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. On July the 2nd, 600 miles east of Newfoundland, the silence broke. At 01:33 hours, the Liberty ship James Wilson, sailing at the rear of the convoy, suddenly surged ahead, its engine roaring as it tried to correct a steering malfunction. In that moment of acceleration, its propellers screamed underwater, a burst of cavitation so loud it registered on hydrophones aboard HMS Bentley 3 miles away. Within minutes, U-202 surfaced just beyond visual range and fired a spread of torpedoes. James Wilson vanished in a pillar of fire and steam, but the rest of the convoy held its discipline. No panic, no speed changes. They sailed on at 9.5 knots, engines humming softly, vanishing into the acoustic fog. The U-boats, deprived of their usual auditory cues, floundered. U-172 surfaced too close to the escort screen and was depth-charged into oblivion. U-564, attempting to close in visually, was spotted by a patrolling Liberator bomber and strafed into the abyss. Only U-600 managed to fire a torpedo, but it missed, its target having executed a silent pre-planned zigzag that the U-boat never heard coming. By dawn, the ghost pack was shattered. HX-242 sailed on, its cargo intact. In Liverpool, Price summoned Voss once more. This time there was no skepticism in his eyes, only grim awe. "We've saved over 10,000 lives since May," he said, sliding a new report across his desk. "Not just sailors, soldiers, airmen, civilians who'll never know their tanks and planes made it across because we learned to shut up." Voss nodded. and it started with a cook who listened. Price hesitated, then opened a locked drawer. He pulled out a small, unmarked box. Inside was a silver medallion. No name, no rank, just an engraving of a ship cutting silently through waves. "For Finch," he said. "Unofficial, untraceable, but real." Voss took it, her fingers brushing the cool metal. She knew Archie would never wear it, but he'd understand its weight. Back aboard the Empire Mallow, now docked for overhaul, Archie received the medallion in private, handed to him by Voss herself during a brief shore leave. She didn't salute. She simply said, "They're calling it the Silent Convoys. No one knows your name, but we do." Archie turned the medallion over in his palm, then slipped it into his pocket. "Good," he said. "Let it stay that way." He had one more convoy to sail, one more meal to cook, one more quiet night to listen to the sea. The sea does not keep time the way men do. It does not mark victories with parades or defeats with memorials. It simply swallows what it must and carries the rest, silent, indifferent, eternal. And so it was that in the late summer of 1943, as the last U-boat wolfpacks limped back to Brest and Lorient with hulls scarred and morale shattered, the North Atlantic returned to a kind of quiet it had not known since the first shots of the war. Not peace, never that, but a reprieve, bought not with thunderous broadsides or daring commando raids, but with restraint, with listening, with the deliberate softening of a ship's voice in the deep. Arthur Archie Finch felt that quiet in his bones long before the Admiralty acknowledged it in its reports. He stood on the deck of the Empire Mallow on August 12, 1943, off the coast of Nova Scotia, watching the sun bleed into the horizon like molten copper. The convoy, HX-251, had just passed the Grand Banks, the most dangerous stretch of ocean in the world, only months before. Now, not a single alarm had sounded in 3 days. No depth charges, no flares, no panicked shouts over the 1MC, just the steady thrum of engines, held at 87 RPM, the gentle slap of waves against the bow, and the distant cry of a gannet wheeling overhead. It was, for the first time in 2 years, ordinary. Ordinary, the word tasted strange in his mouth. For so long, ordinary had meant terror disguised as routine. Waking each dawn, not knowing if you'd see dusk, eating meals with one ear tuned to the hydrophone reports, sleeping in clothes you could drown in. But now ordinary meant safety. And safety, Archie knew, was the rarest luxury of war. He turned and walked back toward the galley, his boots scuffing against wet teak. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of baking bread and simmering beef stew, real beef, not the reconstituted mystery meat of 1941. 2 young stewards were scrubbing pots, laughing over a letter one had received from a girl in Glasgow. Archie paused in the doorway watching them. They had never known the Black May. They had never seen a ship vanish in a column of fire while its crew screamed into the void. To them, the ocean was just water. The war was something happening elsewhere. He envied them. Later that night, during his off-watch, Archie climbed to the boat deck and sat beneath a sky dense with stars, real stars, not the magnesium flares that once turned night into day. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, its pages warped from salt and steam. On the last page, he wrote, "If you want to disappear, don't hide. Just stop making noise." He didn't know it yet, but those words would one day be quoted in a declassified U.S. Navy acoustic warfare manual, attributed only to an unidentified British merchant crewman. 1943, but attribution meant nothing to Archie. What mattered was that the idea had taken root, that captains now checked their tachometers as carefully as their compasses, that engineers debated blade pitch over pints in Liverpool pubs, that a whole generation of naval architects would design ships not just to move fast, but to move quietly. Back in Whitehall, the transformation was already institutional. Operation Silent Keel, never formally named, as such in public, had been folded into the Western approaches. Tactical Unit Standard Doctrine by July. Every new escort vessel now underwent acoustic profiling before deployment. Even the Americans, once dismissive of what they called the British Whisper campaign, had begun, retrofitting Liberty ships with modified propellers at Brooklyn Navy Yard. The results were staggering. Convoys that once lost 15% of their tonnage now arrived with 99% intact. In August alone, over 1.2 million tons of cargo reached Britain, enough to equip 3 full armored divisions. But the true measure of success wasn't in tonnage or statistics. It was in the faces of the men who came home. In September, the Empire Mallow docked in Liverpool for what would be her final wartime voyage. As Archie stepped onto the quay, he was met by a sight that made his throat tighten. A group of women and children waiting at the rail, scanning the crew for fathers, husbands, sons. Among them was a boy of about 10, clutching a handmade sign that read, "Welcome home, Dad. We missed your stories." The man the boy ran to, a stoker named Briggs, scooped him up and buried his face in the child's hair. His shoulders shaking, Archie turned away, not out of discomfort but reverence. He had fed thousands of men like Briggs. He had listened to their fears over lukewarm tea, patched their hunger with dumplings and gravy, watched them age a decade in a single crossing. And now, because of a small, stubborn idea born in a steamy galley, many of them would live to grow old, to tell stories of their own. He never spoke of his role. Not to the press, not to historians, not even to his own family. When his daughter Margaret asked him years later what he'd done in the war, he simply said, "I cooked, and I listened." But others remembered. In October 1943, Commander Lionel Price retired from the Royal Navy. His final act before handing in his commission was to file a sealed dossier with the Naval Historical Branch, Acoustic Anomalies and Civilian Insight in Convoy. Defense, 1942-1943. Inside, among technical appendices and sonar spectrograms, was a single sheet of greaseproof paper, yellowed and brittle, bearing the words, "Tell them to check the props. The fast ones scream underwater. The slow ones don't." Below it, Price had written in his own hand, "This note, dismissed as nonsense on March 5, 1943, may have altered the course of the Atlantic campaign. Never again underestimate the observer without a uniform." Eleanor Voss, meanwhile, went on to become the Royal Navy's first female acoustic warfare advisor. In her memoirs, published in 1967, she devoted an entire chapter to the silent cook, though she never named him. "Innovation," she wrote, "does not always arrive in a laboratory or a war room. Sometimes it arrives in a galley, wrapped in flour and smelling of onions, carried by someone who has no right to speak, but who speaks anyway." The legacy of Archie's insight extended far beyond the war. In the Cold War, US and Soviet submarine designers would obsess over acoustic stealth, spending billions to muffle reactor pumps and reshape propeller blades. The term Finch threshold, unofficial but widely used in naval circles, came to describe the precise RPM below which cavitation ceased in standard merchant hulls. Even today, modern container ships crossing the Atlantic operate under acoustic efficiency protocols that trace their lineage directly to a cook's notebook from 1943. But none of that reached Archie. He reopened his chop house in Hull in the spring of 1946, painting the walls a warm cream and hanging fishing nets from the ceiling as decoration. He hired a young apprentice named Tommy, whose father had gone down with the Fort Concord. One evening, as they peeled potatoes side by side, Tommy asked, "Did you ever do anything brave in the war, Mr. Finch?" Archie paused, knife hovering over a spud. "Bravery's overrated," he said finally. "Mostly you just do what needs doing, even if no one believes you." He never wore his medals. They sat in a shoebox in the attic, next to his old Navy jumper and a faded photograph of the Empire Mallow's crew, taken in Liverpool in 43. In the photo, he stands slightly apart, apron still on, holding a ladle like a scepter. No one is looking at him, but he's watching everyone. He died on a rainy Tuesday in November 1978, at the age of 76. The cause was pneumonia, but those who knew him said he'd simply run out of things to worry about. At his funeral, only family and a few old shipmates attended. One of them, the former stoker Briggs, now a grandfather with a limp from a depth-charge concussion, placed a single white rose on the coffin. "He kept us alive," Briggs told Margaret afterward. "Not with guns, with silence." Decades later, in 2003, the Imperial War Museum opened a new exhibit on the Battle of the Atlantic. Among the torpedoes, Enigma machines and models of U-boats was a small display case labeled "The Power of Listening." Inside, a dented mess tin, a silver medallion engraved with a ship cutting through waves, and a grease-stained notebook open to the page that read, "If you want to disappear, don't hide. Just stop making noise." Visitors often lingered there longer than expected, not because of the artifacts, but because of the quiet that seemed to gather around them, a silence so deep it felt like the ocean itself had stepped into the room, and perhaps it had. For the truth, Archie Finch discovered, was not merely technical, it was human. In a world obsessed with volume, with louder engines, bigger guns, more urgent voices, he had proven that sometimes the most radical act is to lower your voice, to move gently, to listen before you speak, to understand that noise is not strength, and silence is not weakness, but strategy, compassion, survival. The U-boat war was won not because the Allies shouted louder, but because they learned at last to whisper, and in that whisper, 10,000 men heard the sound of home.